January 3, 2026. A dawn of explosions over Caracas. U.S. military aircraft fill Venezuelan skies. By midday, President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores were in U.S. custody, transported to New York to face federal narcotics and terrorism charges. It was a stunning escalation, a direct U.S. military strike on a nation in the Western Hemisphere that reverberated around the world. The White House described it as a law enforcement operation, targeting narco-terrorism and criminal networks. Critics called it a crime of aggression, a blatant breach of international law, and a return to the worst impulses of American imperialism. But beyond official rhetoric, analysts, historians, and policymakers ask, why did this happen? What motivated the United States, a global superpower, to launch a military raid into a sovereign country just 2,200 kilometers away? The answer lies in a complex web of history, economics, geopolitics, ideology, and power. To understand 2026, we must go back decades. In the late 20th century, Venezuela's vast oil reserves made it strategically important. Throughout the 20th century, U.S. energy companies maintained deep ties to Venezuela's petroleum industry. But political relations fluctuated, often over ideology and control of natural resources. Then came Hugo Chavez, elected president in 1998. A fiery anti-imperialist influenced by socialism, Chavez openly challenged U.S. global policies. He nationalized Venezuelan oil assets, expanded social programs, and forged alliances with Cuba, Iran, China, and Russia, actors often at odds with Washington. These policies made Caracas a persistent irritant in U.S. strategic thinking. Maduro, Chavez's successor, continued this path. His government faced economic collapse, humanitarian crisis, shortages of food and medicine, and millions fleeing the country. A migration wave that eventually hit U.S. southern borders. The United States denounced Maduro's elections as fraudulent and recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as interim president, applying sanctions and diplomatic pressure. The conflict with Venezuela was never just about drugs or migration. It was always rooted in control over resources, markets, and political influence in the Western Hemisphere. As tensions deepened, Washington imposed escalating sanctions, targeted Venezuela's oil revenues, and increasingly isolated Caracas internationally. But these moves didn't stop Maduro, nor did they rebuild Venezuela's economy. Instead, they sharpened hostility and set the stage for confrontation. When the U.S. struck Venezuela in January 2026, the administration offered several official reasons. 1. Narco-terrorism and criminal networks. For years, U.S. officials accused Maduro's government of involvement with narcotics trafficking networks like Cartel de los Soles. The U.S. even designated some Venezuelan groups as foreign terrorist organizations. Venezuelan leaders were indicted in U.S. courts on drug and narco-terrorism charges. Trump administration spokesperson, soundbite. We acted to disrupt a narco-terrorist regime that threatens the security of the United States. 2. Border security and migration. U.S. officials linked instability and poverty in Venezuela to surges of migration toward the U.S. southern border. They argued that Venezuela's collapse exacerbated regional displacement and posed economic and security challenges. America has long argued its interventions are aimed at promoting democracy and human rights. In the case of Venezuela, Washington maintained that Maduro's government was illegitimate and repressive, justifying pressure and eventual military action as necessary to restore democratic governance. These narratives were central to the U.S.'s public case, but critics argue they mask deeper strategic motives. At the center of Venezuela's significance lies one unmistakable fact. It sits atop the world's largest proven crude oil reserves. In an era of geopolitical competition, energy is power. Venezuela's oil and its vast mineral wealth make it a prize in global strategic calculations. Throughout 2025, the U.S. escalated maritime strikes, seized Venezuelan tankers, and blocked sanctioned oil exports. Oil revenues are the lifeblood of Venezuela's economy. By cutting off those revenues through sanctions and blockades, the U.S. hoped to weaken Maduro's regime and force political change. But critics argue that dismantling someone's economy only deepens misery and destabilizes the region. By early 2026, Following the raid and capture of Maduro, U.S. leaders signaled a swift return to oil markets, announcing plans for Venezuela to sell 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the United States, with American companies potentially aiding in its revival. Energy analyst soundbite. Control of oil infrastructure and revenue isn't just commercial, it's geopolitical. Whoever controls energy flows shapes global power dynamics. Geopolitical rivalries. Venezuela's alliances with China, Russia, and Iran heightened tensions. Washington viewed these partnerships as encroachments on its traditional sphere of influence in the Americas, harking back to the old Monroe Doctrine, which long warned European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. In 2026, critics dubbed the new policy direction the Monroe Doctrine, referencing an aggressive posture under President Trump. This entanglement turned Venezuela into more than a bilateral issue. It became part of broader strategic competition between global powers. International law sharply constrains the use of force. The United Nations Charter prohibits unilateral military intervention in sovereign states except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. The 2026 U.S. action lacked UN Security Council approval. The U.S. justified it as law enforcement in response to criminal activity. But legal experts and UN representatives called that interpretation dubious. UN Human Rights Office statement. The intervention violates international law and undermines global security. Venezuela's future should be decided by its people. At the UN Security Council, multiple nations, including Brazil, China, Russia, Colombia, and Mexico, condemned the U.S. operation as a crime of aggression, an unlawful use of force. Absent UN approval or imminent self-defense, such use of force breaches the UN Charter and sets a dangerous precedent. This legal controversy deepened global concern. If major powers act unilaterally, what safeguards remain for smaller states? Military force was only the latest chapter in a long campaign. For years, the U.S. waged economic warfare through sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil industry, financial transactions, and state revenues. These measures aimed to squeeze Caracas and reduce Maduro's grip on power. Critics argue that these sanctions were not just punitive. They crippled an economy already in crisis, intensified humanitarian suffering, and widened the gulf between Venezuelans and the international community. Sanctions become a tool of political coercion. But can damaging an entire nation's economy ever be justified as diplomacy? And when economic pressure fails, does the world accept a military invasion as the next step? These questions haunt policymakers and historians alike. Beyond official rationales and geopolitical analysis, a wide range of alternative explanations have surfaced, from the plausible to the speculative. In online forums and commentary, some argue the attack was about maintaining U.S. dominance of the global petrodollar system, ensuring oil continues to be traded in dollars, a pillar of U.S. economic influence. Others emphasize mineral wealth, value systems, or ideological battles between socialism and capitalism. While not all these interpretations are supported by evidence, they reflect broader frustrations. That decisions of war and peace are too often driven by power, profit, and influence, not human welfare. What does this mean for ordinary Venezuelans? The U.S. operation sparked mixed reactions. Some celebrated Maduro's removal, hoping for political change and economic relief. Others fear a new form of foreign domination, loss of sovereignty, and deeper instability. Regionally, the attack heightened fears of further interventions. Mexico, Colombia, and other neighbors voiced concern about a broader U.S. military agenda. We want peace and dignity, not more power struggles fought on our streets. Meanwhile, humanitarian needs remain urgent. Venezuelans still face shortages, migration pressures continue, and rebuilding trust will take years. The U.S. attack on Venezuela in 2026 will be studied for generations. Was it justified? Was it necessary? Was it effective? The official answers range from narco-terrorism and border security to restoring democracy. But beneath the surface lie competing pressures. Oil geopolitics, global strategic rivalries, decades of sanctions, economic interests, and the broader contest for influence in the Western Hemisphere. Whatever the outcome, this episode forces a fundamental question. Should powerful nations impose their will with force when diplomacy falters? And at what cost? History will judge whether this was a moment of liberation, dominance, or tragedy. For Venezuela, the war is not just external. It is deeply internal, shaped by a history of struggle, resilience, and aspirations for a future defined not by empires, but by its own people.